Okay, so this will be the third video about the wings. I know it's a lot, but these are hard to do. A few things that I forgot to talk about. My camera randomly went out of focus. It happens. These inspection rings, I put 2 of them on each wing. This one's constrained because it goes underneath the fuel. It's called a finger screen that you actually have to remove. I had some issues with this in a previous video. It's because the part they sent me is different than the one that's in the manual, but this allows you to actually unscrew it. There's a little sort of elbow that goes down there, and at the end of the day, you'll be able to cut this out, pull the elbow out by spinning it this way, and inspect this finger screen. So that one's constrained to how this is present. You do need to reinforce this sump. This is actually the fuel sump hole for basically draining fuel out of the tank. I forgot to put an inspection ring or a reinforcement ring on there earlier, but that's one is there. And then this inspection ring, I just mirrored it for the other wing. The pitot plate goes here on the other wing, and this is the right wing. So I figured I'd just mirror it here. It probably would have been better to put this here for a couple reasons. One, the manual does say that you should put the inspection ring behind these false ribs. So the false ribs end right there. So I should have put the inspection ring either behind it there, but ideally it would have been there so I could access this little spar cutout, whatever you want to call it. And then it is supposed to be behind the false ribs. So I watched Brian Bowen and said, hey, that looks like a good spot. But in reality, I should have put it either further back or over here, according to the manual. Unfortunately, there's no diagram that shows you the right way of doing it. So I still don't know if this is right, and I seriously don't know what I'm doing. But the manual does expressly say, make sure they're behind the false ribs. So if you are going to put it near the pitot, back here would probably be a better place. But if I wanted to do it again, I would definitely put it right there. One of the strategies that I forgot to mention in another wing videos was how to deal with these. These are struts. These are the strut cutouts. So they attach to the spars there, and this is where my main strut comes and attaches to the plane. This is actually where most of the weight of the wing sits, which is interesting, but not really relevant for this video. These protrude from the fabric if you just lay it right on top of them. So the polyfiber manual says specifically that anything that's less than 2 inches, so this is less than 2 inches, it's about 2 inches actually, you should leave it, don't cut a hole until after you shrink it. So you shrink the fabric over this spar cutout, or not spar cutout, it's called a strut cutout. You shrink the fabric over there, then cut it and it'll snap down. So these ones are pretty tricky because you have a reinforcement plate there. There's actually a little aluminum sheet that goes and reinforces the fabric behind there. So you actually have to slip those in ahead of time. Well, you had to pre-coat them with polybrush, slip them in ahead of time, and then somehow glue them to the fabric once you get it cut. So the first one I actually had a hard time because I shrunk this all to 350, did the final shrink, and then cut the holes as the polyfiber manual says, and then glued it down to the fabric, and there was nothing left for me to shrink wrinkles out. So I ended up chasing wrinkles for a while. You can't tell because I spent a lot of time with an iron. But that strategy didn't work very well. So what I did from then on, and I'm actually doing it on the fuselage, I'll show how it works, is you lay the fabric down, you shrink it to 250, then you cut the holes for these cutouts. And the same thing with these jury strut tabs here. You basically lay it on top, shrink it to 250, and then once it's shrunk to 250, you burn holes in or cut them out, however you want to do it. I used my burning tool, which I'm going to show you. You burn the holes out and glue it down around there and get all the wrinkles out, because you'll have some extra material left in terms of temperature fluctuation. Like you can turn the heat up and get the remaining wrinkles out from that shrink. And then once you get those holes cut and all the wrinkles gone, then you can do a full 350 shrink, and you won't be chasing odd wrinkles that you can't shrink out because there's nothing left to shrink. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that is my strategy. And I'll show how that works because I'm doing that right now on the fuselage. I never got to talking about my general strategy now for covering the wing, which if I had to redo them again, this is what I would do. And I didn't determine this until obviously the second one because, you know, it's like Indiana Jones here. You're trying to figure out everything on your own. The manual doesn't really help you with all this stuff. So what I do is pre-coat all of the ribs with polytack, thick. So make sure you have a lot of thick polytack on the ribs. And all the ribs, the leading edge, And everything inside that you can't get to, you pre-coat it. Then you lay the fabric down and just attach the trailing edge so that it's just bonded in one place. So basically you wrap it around, attach the trailing edge right down here, which you can't see, it's on the bottom. And that becomes your main bond. Then you drape the fabric over. Don't even trim it yet. I drape the fabric all the way over. I'll then tack it to the front so that it's in place. And then you tack it to the ends so that it's in place, just the two ends. So you tack it to these two ends. Then trim the ends. You get it all nice and smooth in a straight line. So I just use a ruler where I just go on and mark a straight line and then cut it. Then shrink it to 250. And I know this sounds crazy, but I shrunk everything to 250. And that forces it to lay flat on top of all the ribs on the inside of all of your bonds. Once it lays flat, then you go through with the thin polytack, which is a 50-50 blend between MEK and polytack, and you just force all these seams down on that pre-coated surface, and it saves you a lot of energy chasing out wrinkles. Because if you were to go through and pre-bond these, then you're essentially shrinking every bay individually, and there ends up being a lot of wrinkles that probably, they don't have to be there if you use this method. So the general concept is you tack down the perimeter and then go through and bond your interior bonding portions to a pre-coated surface after it's been shrunk. So that ended up working really well on the second wing, and if I had to do it again, that's what I would do. And that's honestly, I'm not really doing that on the fuselage because it's a whole different process, but that's sort of the best technique with covering the wing. Okay, so there are some things in the kit that are not included. I've just accepted that as a fact. One of those things that is not included are finish tapes. They include 2-inch tapes, and that's pretty much it. I guess you get a 3-inch tape. Bias tapes are not included, which is something that was a little bit frustrating to me because they're effectively essential. The other thing that's not included are these 1-inch tapes. What they do is they say, take a 2-inch tape and cut it in half, and that just seems silly to me. So I ended up ordering a bunch of 1-inch tapes, and those go on all the false ribs here. I feel like I'm going to use them on the fuselage as well, so I bought some extra. I bought just 2 rolls, and that turns out to be more than enough, at least to cover this. I only have used one roll on all the false ribs for both wings. The other one is, this is a 3-inch tape. I believe this was included. I ended up throwing a 3-inch tape on this whole spar cutout because I think it just kind of looks nicer. Putting a 2-inch tape would have been sufficient, but the 3-inch tape is also nice. And then this is a 4-inch tape, which is not included, and that keeps that same 2-inch look around the entire bottom of the aircraft with the exclusion of this middle tape. So basically I have 2 inches wrapped on one side of the trailing edge, and that wraps all the way around, and there's another 2-inch on the other side. So those finish tapes are not included in the kit, but I'd say that they're really good to have. I did buy a 6-inch finish tape that I don't think I'll need. I have used it for all my cutouts and doilies and things like that because it's pre-shrunk. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to cover the leading edge with a 6-inch tape because I use my crazy leading edge covering technique. So 6-inch tape, maybe not essential, but definitely the 1-inch, the 3-inch, the 4-inch, and all the bias tapes are not included, but excellent to have. I've been talking about this cupping in the fiberglass. I think, I wasn't very clear about it in my last video. I think it was because somebody sat there with an iron too long and actually warped the fiberglass underneath. Once I put the finish tape on, which is this weird leading edge finish tape piece, you can't really see it, but there are these little divots in the fiberglass. You can kind of see the outline right here. And there's another one there, and there's another one there, and I think there's one more down over on this end of the wing somewhere. But that, I believe, was a product of improper ironwork, but I'm really curious to see what it looks like when it gets a coat of paint on, to see if it's really a bad mistake or if it was just sort of an unwarranted fear. So we'll let you know what that looks like soon. One thing I also recently discovered was that I was using the little fiberglass cutouts with masking tape to block the fuel cap. That ended up being a problem because once I tried to pull it off recently, and it ended up peeling all of the poly brush off, and it made sort of like vinyl film, and it sort of just pulled it all the way back to the edges of the fabric here. So what I've decided to do instead is just put the fuel cap on. This one hasn't been plugged, but I'll plug that with a piece of masking tape. And that will actually seal my tank off, and it won't get stuck to the poly brush like the other ones will. And basically what I went and did was I put another coat of poly brush in there just to make sure that that coat that I peeled off got replaced. And from now on, that'll be my way of plugging the fuel tank. All right, I couldn't find this tool the other day, but I found it. This is Peter's Special. It's my Boleto Vineyards cork that has a stainless steel welding rod with a tiny point on the end. And of course, one of my favorite tools in the whole world, which is this torch. This is what I was talking about with tenting things through the fabric. Here's a little, it's a hole that, I don't know what attaches to there, but something attaches there into the future. But you see how it's kind of poking out through the fabric? I've shrunk this already to a 250. The manual would say shrink it to 350 and then cut this hole. But if you do that, then there's nothing left to pull the wrinkles out. So you shrink it to 250, which this is shrunk to 250, just a preliminary. You then take this, you heat the tip of the needle, so it's red hot. And this is a stainless steel needle, so I can do that, and then I can grab this other end and it's not hot. If you used aluminum, you would burn your hands off. So that gets red hot. Then come over to this and just melt the edge. Still not quite enough. People use soldering irons, but I find this needle to be very effective. Jesus. Okay, there we go. So now that's poked all the way through, and I can come through and clean all this excess little burned fabric off. And also all these wrinkles around here can get pulled out with a 350 shrink. And this will take I'll put in a little inspection ring on there with a reinforcement ring with Polytac. But that's what I did for the wings also. If there was any protrusion, I used that same method. It was a little easier to cut them out, but same idea.